I still have his voicemail saved. I haven't listened to it since that night. I don't need to. I know what he said, and I know what I did after. And I've made my peace with both. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 67 years old. I spent 41 years building something real in this country. And the last thing my son ever did to me in public was look me in the eyes and tell me I was an embarrassment to him. That was 8 months ago. I have not spoken to him since. I don't plan to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. My father worked the mines. My mother cleaned houses on the north end of the city 3 days a week and came home smelling like bleach and other people's lives. We were not poor in the way that breaks you, but we were careful. Every dollar had a job. You didn't spend what you hadn't earned, and you didn't ask for what wasn't yours. That was the household I came from. That was the only education that ever really stayed with me. I moved to Calgary when I was 24, had $200, a duffel bag, and a trade certificate in electrical work. I spent 12 years doing commercial installations, office towers, industrial parks, the kind of work that leaves your hands permanently rough and your knees aching by the time you're 40. I saved. I lived small. I drove the same truck for 11 years because it still ran and vanity wasn't something I could afford. By the time I was 40, I had enough to buy into a small electrical contracting firm with a partner, a man named Clive, who I'd worked beside since my second year in the city. Clive was steady. Clive was honest. We shook hands on things we later put in writing, and the writing never said anything the handshake hadn't already promised. We built that company over 20 years into something that employed 32 people at its height. My wife, Carol, was beside me for all of it. We met when I was 28 and she was 26 at a company Christmas party for the firm she did bookkeeping for. She was the only person there not holding a drink, and I asked her why, and she said she didn't drink at work functions because she didn't trust herself not to say something honest. I thought that was the most sensible thing I'd ever heard anyone say. We were married 14 months later. Carol and I had one child, our son. We named him after Carol's grandfather, a name she loved and I grew to love because she did. He was born in 1989, premature by 6 weeks, tiny in a way that scared us both in that NICU waiting room, in a way I've never been scared before or since. He made it. He was fine. He grew up healthy and loud and full of himself in the way that only children often are. And we loved that about him because we loved him, and loving someone means loving the whole shape of them, even the parts that aren't easy. He was not a bad child. I want to be clear about that. He was not cruel or dishonest as a boy. He was impatient, competitive, easily frustrated when things didn't come quickly, but those weren't sins. I had those same qualities at his age, and I learned, eventually, to turn them into something useful. I thought he would too. He was smart enough to get into the University of Alberta's business program. Carol cried at his convocation. I shook his hand and told him I was proud of him, and I meant it the way I mean most things, completely and without performance. After he graduated, he came to work with me. Not for me. I made that distinction clear from the beginning because I thought it mattered. I gave him a real role, a real salary, real responsibility. I didn't want him to feel like the owner's son. I wanted him to feel like someone who'd earned his place. For the first few years, it worked. He was good with clients. He had a confidence in meetings that I'd never had naturally. I'd always been better with the work than the room. He learned the business quickly. I started thinking about the future in a way that felt like relief rather than anxiety. I had spent 4 decades building something, and now I could see who it might belong to after me. I retired partially at 63. Still came in 2 days a week, stayed on the board, kept my hand in. My partner Clive had sold his share back to the company 2 years earlier when his wife got sick and they moved to Victoria. My son held the operational reins. I let him. Carol got her diagnosis in the spring of 2021. Pancreatic, stage 3. We had 7 months from that appointment to the morning I sat in the hospice room and held her hand while her breathing changed, and then stopped. 7 months is both longer than you think and not nearly enough. My son was there. He came to the hospital. He sat with us. He cried. I don't doubt that grief was real. Carol adored him in the specific, exhausting way that mothers adore only sons. And he knew it. And he let himself be adored without giving much back, which was something she never complained about. and something I noticed but said nothing about because Carol was happy, and I was not going to be the person who complicated her happiness. After she died, things shifted. Not immediately. Grief does strange things to the geometry of a family, bends relationships into shapes you don't recognize until you've been living in them a while. By the following year, I noticed I was being included in fewer decisions. Not excluded dramatically, just not included. Emails I used to be copied on stopped coming. Meetings I would have sat in on were scheduled without me. I told myself this was natural. He was running the company. I had stepped back. This was the transition. But it wasn't just the company. He'd been married for 4 years by then, to a woman I will call difficult because that is the most accurate word I have for her. And it is the kindest. She was not unkind to my face. She was careful, polished, the kind of person who says exactly the right thing in exactly the right tone, so that later, when you feel uneasy, you can't point to anything specific. I don't blame her for everything that came after. I blame my son, because he is a grown man, and grown men are responsible for what they do. In the spring of last year, my son came to me with a proposal. He wanted to buy out my remaining stake in the company. He had numbers prepared. The numbers were not insulting on paper. They were roughly fair by one methodology and significantly below by 2 others. I told him I wanted to have my own accountant look at it. He said, of course. My accountant looked at it. She came back with concerns. The valuation had used a compressed EBITDA multiple that didn't reflect current market conditions for electrical contracting firms of our size in Alberta. The offer, she said, was structured to look reasonable while capturing significantly less than I was actually owed. I brought this back to my son. His response was not what I expected. He did not argue with the numbers. He didn't ask to see my accountant's analysis. He looked at me across my own kitchen table, the table Carol and I had bought at an estate sale in Inglewood in 2003, the table where we'd had 1,000 dinners. And he said that perhaps this was becoming too complicated for me to manage on my own. Too complicated for me to manage. I asked him what he meant by that. He said that he and his wife had been talking, and they were worried about me, about my decision-making, about whether I was processing things clearly since losing my mother. He called Carol my mother. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, very quietly, that Carol was my wife, that I had been making financial decisions longer than he had been alive, and that if he wanted to continue this conversation, he should come back with a fair offer and leave his concerns about my cognitive state at the door. He left. We didn't speak for 3 weeks. Then he called and asked if I wanted to come to dinner. A restaurant downtown, a new place on 17th Avenue that he said had been getting good reviews. I said yes because he was my son and because I still believed then that things could be repaired. The restaurant was the kind of place where the menu was short and the portions are architectural, and the room is designed to feel exclusive without being loud about it. My son was already there when I arrived, sitting with his wife and 2 other couples I didn't know well. Business associates of his, he said, though he didn't introduce me in a way that gave me any context. The evening started well enough. I ordered the lamb. I had a glass of red wine. I listened more than I talked, which is my habit at rooms where I don't know everyone. And I watched my son perform his version of himself, expansive, charming, comfortable in his own importance. Then one of the men at the table, the louder of the 2, someone in commercial real estate, said something about a local development project, and my son mentioned the company, and the man asked if we were a family operation. And my son said, and these are as close to his exact words as I can give you, that it was transitioning out of that model because certain older structures weren't agile enough for current market demands. I put my fork down. I looked at him. He was not looking at me. I said his name. He looked at me then, and in his eyes was something I had not seen before in 40 years of knowing him. Not anger, not embarrassment, something colder. The look of a person who has already decided something and is tired of waiting for the conversation to catch up. I said, quietly, so that only he could hear, what you just said is not accurate, and you know it isn't. He leaned back in his chair. He set down his own fork, and then, in front of his wife, in front of 2 couples he was trying to impress, in front of a room full of people I would never see again, he said, loud enough that it carried, that he was sorry I was having trouble following the conversation, and that maybe I should consider whether evenings like this were still something I could handle. The table went quiet. I looked at my son. I picked up my napkin. I folded it once, set it beside my plate. I stood up. I said, "Excuse me," walked to the front of the restaurant, collected my jacket from the coat check, and stepped outside into the November air on 17th Avenue. And I stood there for 60 seconds breathing. Then I got in my car and I drove home. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I have cried exactly twice, as an adult, when my father died in 1998 and the morning carol passed. This did not produce tears. What it produced was something quieter and more permanent, a decision that arrived fully formed, the way the most important decisions sometimes do, without deliberation, without drama. I called my lawyer that night. He had been my lawyer for 22 years. A man named Hugh who understood both contracts and human nature in roughly equal measure. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, then asked me what I wanted to do. I told him. Hugh said he would need a few days to prepare the documents correctly. I said, "Take the time you need, but I'd like to move before the end of the month." The house my son and his wife lived in was a property I had purchased in 2019 before the market ran in a neighborhood in northwest Calgary called Tuscany. I had bought it as an investment and they had been living in it under a verbal arrangement, no formal lease, no market rent. I had paid the property taxes, the insurance, the major maintenance. The title was in my name. The company shares were also still partially mine, enough that certain structural decisions required my signature. Over the following 9 days, I signed the documents Hugh prepared. The house went to a realtor. A quiet listing, priced correctly for the market, accepted offer within 11 days. The proceeds went into a separate account I had opened in my name, only at a different institution than the one my son and I had used jointly for business purposes. I also, with Hugh's guidance, formalized my position on the company's board in a way that required any significant transaction, including the buyout offer still on the table, to go through an independent valuation process before I could legally be obligated to consider it. I did not tell my son any of this while it was happening. The week the sale completed, I booked a flight to Halifax. I had not been to Nova Scotia since Carol and I went for our anniversary in 2009. I wanted the ocean, and I wanted distance, and I wanted to be somewhere that had nothing to do with any of this. 3 days before my flight, my son received the formal notice from the realtor's office that the property had been sold and that he and his wife had 60 days to vacate. He called me 11 times in 40 minutes. I let every call go to voicemail. Then he came to my house. He stood at my front door and knocked, then knocked harder, then rang the bell repeatedly, and I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, and I did not go to the door. I could hear him through the glass. His voice was loud, and then it broke, and then it was loud again. He said things I won't repeat here, not because they were unspeakable, but because they no longer belonged to me. At some point, he stopped. I heard his car door, heard him leave. I finished my tea. I washed the cup. I went to bed. The next morning, I had a message from my daughter-in-law sent at 2 a.m., several paragraphs long. I read it once. It was written to wound, and it was not unskilled work. I closed it and did not respond. The morning I left for the airport, the city was doing what Calgary does in late November, gray and cold and completely indifferent to individual circumstances, which I appreciated. I had one check bag and my carry-on, and the particular lightness of a person who has recently stopped carrying something they carried for too long. At the gate, I called Hugh and confirmed everything was in order. He said it was. He asked how I was. I said I was fine, which was both true and incomplete, the way most honest answers are. The flight to Halifax was 4.5 hours. I slept for most of it, which surprised me. I had expected to sit with my thoughts, but apparently my body had its own opinion about what I needed. I booked a room at a small inn in the South End, 2 blocks from the water. The woman who ran it was in her 70s and had the accent and the manner of someone who had been dealing with the Atlantic her entire life and had arrived at a useful sort of peace with its moods. She gave me a corner room with a window that looked toward the harbor. I stood at that window for a long time the first night, watching the lights on the water and trying to locate something I could name as regret. I couldn't find it. That surprised me too. I walked the waterfront every morning. I ate fish chowder at a place on the boardwalk that opened early. I read a novel Carol had recommended years ago that I'd never gotten around to. I called an old friend of mine, a man named Douglas I'd worked with in the trades decades ago, who had moved east for retirement, and we had dinner at his kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with money or companies or sons. What I found in those 10 days was not peace exactly. Peace suggests the wound is closed, and it wasn't. It was more like clarity, the sense of having moved through something and arrived somewhere that, while not comfortable, was at least honest. I had loved my son for his entire life. I had given him everything I was capable of giving, without diminishing myself. And he had, in a room full of strangers, decided that I was something to be managed. I don't know where he is now in his thinking about all of this. I have not taken his calls. I received a letter through Hugh's office in January, a formal letter drafted by someone legal, expressing interest in resolving outstanding matters. Hugh is handling that. The buyout offer was reevaluated by an independent firm. The new number was 31% higher than the original proposal. My son's lawyer has not yet responded. I am writing this from my house in Calgary on a Tuesday afternoon in March, with coffee and the kind of quiet that used to feel like loneliness, and now feels like something I chose. The table in the kitchen is still Carol's table from Inglewood. I eat at it every morning. I talk to her sometimes, not in a way I think she can hear, but in the way that keeps the shape of her present in a room. I don't know what my son will do with the 60 days. I don't know if he will come around or harden or find some middle distance to live in. I don't know if I will hear from him in a way that means something, and I don't know if I will be able to receive it if I do. What I know is this. I am 67 years old. I got up this morning and made breakfast and walked to the end of my street and back, and the air was cold and clean and mine. I have enough. I have always had enough, in the ways that matter. I just spent 40 years making sure someone else did too, and somewhere along the way he forgot that was something someone did for him. He'll remember, or he won't. I boarded the plane back from Halifax on a Friday. They handed me a menu. I looked out the window at the runway lights and thought about Carol, and thought about my father's hands, and thought about the electrical company Clive and I built in a city neither of us was born in, and I felt, underneath everything, a quiet kind of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the fact that when the moment came, I knew exactly what I was worth.